You've seen the slow-mo sword fights, the noble duels, the dramatic last stands, but real medieval combat, it was filthy, loud, chaotic. And when his helmet cracked open in the first minute, he realized this wasn't a movie. It was survival. Hey guys, tonight we're diving into the brutal truth about medieval battles Hollywood won't show you. Forget the chivalry, the honor, and the perfectly timed camera angles. This is the real deal. Up close, unfiltered, and absolutely disgusting. So before you get too comfortable, dim the lights. Maybe grab a snack, preferably something that doesn't look like organs, and let's get into it. You wake up before dawn, already sweating in your padded armor. Not because of battle anxiety, though that's real, but because you've been sleeping next to 5 other guys in a barn that smells like dead rats and wet socks. Your breakfast, moldy bread, water that may or may not give you dysentery, and a quick prayer that today you don't get stabbed in the eye. That's the core. You grab your weapon, which by the way, probably isn't a shiny longsword forged by elven gods. It's a rusted iron stick that's dented from the last guy who used it and didn't survive. Now imagine this, your shoulder in a shield wall, surrounded by equally terrified men who smell like onions and fear. The guy next to you hasn't bathed in weeks. You're breathing in sweat, mud, and the occasional whiff of something way worse. And when the two lines finally clash, there's no graceful fencing, no honor, just blind, swinging, screaming, slipping in mud, or worse, intestines, while trying to remember which way is forward. Your helmet blocks your vision. Your armor, heavy, hot, and if you fall, good luck getting back up before someone turns you into a human pincushion. You don't fight one guy at a time. You get mobbed, tackled, crushed. It's not a duel, it's a meat grinder. Let's say you land a hit, congrats. Except now, your blade's stuck in someone's ribcage, and you have about 0.6 seconds before someone else swings at your skull. Or maybe you're the one who slips, and that moment of clumsiness ends with a mace to the spine. Hollywood rarely shows the downtime, the panic attacks in the mud, the wounded screaming for their mothers, the rats that arrive before the medics. Oh, and the medics. Their idea of treatment is cut it off and hope you don't die. The smell, burnt flesh, blood, horse crap, and fear, that's your air freshener now. You make it out alive. Great. Except now your leg's broken, your friend's missing half a face, and your commander thinks this was a minor skirmish. You eat whatever's left. You try to sleep, again, next to the dead, the dying, and the drunk. You don't cry, not because you're brave, but because you're too tired to feel anything. And the next morning, you do it all over again. But what happens when the enemy doesn't follow the rules of war? What about the psychological toll, the nightmares, the silence after the noise? And what did they do when they ran out of weapons, but not enemies? What comes after the chaos isn't silence. It's something far stranger, and far more disturbing. The battle's over. You survived, but no one's cheering. There's no rousing music, no slow motion fist pump, just the squelch of your boots in blood-soaked mud and the buzzing of flies that got here faster than the priests. You start counting who's missing. You stop at 10, because it's easier not to know. And that smell, it's not just the dead, it's everything. Ruptured organs, spilled ale, sweat, open wounds, and the unmistakable stench of someone losing control of their bowels mid-charge. You're not crying because you're sad. You're crying because your brain is trying to reboot. Now, let's talk medicine. Forget the white tents, sterile tools, or sexy battlefield nurses from the movies. What you get is a guy who once helped a blacksmith and now calls himself a surgeon. His solution for everything: heat the blade, hold him down, chop it off. No anesthesia, just a piece of leather to bite on or not. Infections practically guaranteed. Survival 50-50. And if you're lucky, you keep your leg and your name. Because some of these poor souls, they'll be buried in mass graves with no marker. Just guy who screamed a lot and smelled like cabbage. Here's something else Hollywood leaves out. The silence after the battle is somehow louder than the fight itself. You hear the same scream in your head on repeat. You keep touching the same spot on your armor where the blade almost got you. You laugh randomly. You cry for no reason. You wake up punching the air. Back then, they didn't have a name for it. No therapy, no support groups. You were just weird or cursed, maybe possessed, so they chained you up, or sent you back into the next fight, hoping you'd snap out of it. Spoiler, you didn't. Let's kill another myth while we're at it. Dying in battle wasn't some glorious cinematic exit. It was messy, undignified, and often deeply dumb. People tripped on roots and got trampled. Some bled out from a pinky wound because, surprise, blood doesn't care how small the cut is if it hits right artery and looters. They weren't noble scavengers. They were survivors trying to scrape enough armor off a corpse to trade for food. Sometimes they took the boots before the body stopped twitching. Despite all this, they kept fighting. Not because they were brave. Not always. But because they were told to, paid to, or had nothing else to go back to. And deep down, maybe they thought if they fought hard enough, they'd become legends. But most didn't. Most were forgotten. So what was it that kept them standing? What did they whisper to themselves in the dark? What was left after the swords were sheathed? The wounds had scabbed, and the stories turned into lies told over ale. Some say the battle ends when the last man falls. Others say that's when the real war begins. The stink never really leaves you. You could scrub until your skin bled, and you'd still smell it, the rot, the blood, the sour mix of fear and filth soaked into your clothes, your armor, your skin. You weren't just a soldier. You were a walking scent of death. And if you think your enemies smelled better, think again. The only thing worse than fighting someone who wants to kill you is fighting someone who hasn't bathed since the last harvest. Hollywood treats armor like a force field, but in real life, it was just slightly better clothing. It might stop a glancing blow, sure, but a well-aimed axe, a spear with momentum, that shiny steel plate, bent like a tin can, and chainmail, great, until someone figures out gravity and a spike. Worse, you probably paid for it, or inherited it off a dead cousin, or looted it off someone who didn't quite need it anymore. Heavy, always, stylish, not even once, useful. Sometimes, but it never made you invincible. It just made you slightly less immediately dead. Want to hear the real horror? Half the time, the enemy wasn't a sword. It was hunger. Food ran out fast. Campaigns dragged on. And guess what doesn't grow in trampled mud filled with corpses? You rationed, you begged. Some even went darker. That horse that died in the last charge. Yeah, you're not just burying it, you're eating it. And when things got really bad, let's just say, bones were found, with marks. But no one talked about it, because in war, shame had an expiration date. Survival didn't. Before the battle, you prayed. Not because you were holy, but because everyone did. Even the guy who swore constantly and stole from the church Tithe still mumbled a desperate chant before going in. You clutched amulets, kissed tokens, made promises to gods you barely believed in, and if your side lost, you said it was the devil's work, or a bad omen, or maybe the stars weren't right, because the truth, the cold, chaotic randomness of death, was too much to swallow without a story to numb it. Let's crush one more illusion. You probably didn't choose to be here. You weren't defending your kingdom. You were told to fight. By a lord who'd never seen a battlefield, from a castle you weren't allowed inside. And if you didn't go, you were branded a coward, or worse, hanged. So you marched. Not because you wanted to, but because in this world, wanting didn't matter. Your job was simple: survive the day, even if it meant leaving pieces of yourself behind. Screen fades to a smoky battlefield again. A single sword, stuck upright in the ground, rusted at the hilt. Thunder rolls. A crow lands on the blade. But what did they really fight for? And what happened when the war didn't end? It just changed its name. Here's the part Hollywood fades out before the credits. The war ends. But you don't go back to your old life, because your old life doesn't exist anymore. Your farm's overgrown, your parents buried, your name forgotten by the Lord you served. The only thing waiting for you is silence and cold and a bad knee. You came home a hero. No banners, no feast, just a neighbor who doesn't recognize you, a child who hides behind a doorway, and nightmares that don't end when you open your eyes. You remember what it felt like to run someone through, not in glory, but in panic, in instinct. And now, you don't flinch at blood, you flinch at kindness. Because out there, kindness got people killed. Out there, you had to be the monster. And now that you're back, everyone's pretending the monster should just go back to being a man. But no one told you how. You try to talk about it. Once, people shift in their seats. They laugh nervously. They say, "Don't be so dark. You made it back, didn't you?" As if survival was the reward. As if survival didn't come with interest. So you stop talking. And eventually, you stop remembering. Or at least, you pretend to. Centuries later, they'll tell your story, but not the real one. They'll rewrite it with cleaner lines and nobler causes. You'll become a nameless soldier in a glorious battle, a silhouette in a tapestry, a side character in a king's myth. They won't mention the lice, the screams, the fact that half your friends died face down in the mud over someone else's land dispute. No, your war will be polished until it gleams, a legend scrubbed of pain. And yet, you mattered, not because of glory, not because of victory, but because you were there. You held the line when you could have run. You walked back through fire for someone who couldn't walk at all. You endured, even if no bard sang your name, even if no one ever will. But what happens when history forgets the human cost completely? When even the myths lose their blood and bones? What are we left with? When the story is all armor and no flesh? Somewhere, centuries later, someone shouts, "Cut." A director waves his hands. An actor complains about his chainmail scratching his neck. They'll shoot it again. Make the blood land just right. Make the hero grunt on cue, die dramatically, fall beautifully, eyes wide, still pretty, and the audience, they'll clap, because it felt real enough. But what they saw was a painting. You lived the scream behind the canvas. History books won't tell you about the boy who froze to death on night watch, or the man who started muttering to trees after the siege. They don't write down the smell of gangrene, the weight of dragging a dying friend back through mud, The way time bends during a charge. A second becomes a lifetime, then snaps back with a blade. Instead, they give you numbers. Battles won, casualties lost. A tally of bodies, not lives. Years later, you're mending tools or fixing a fence when it hits you. A sudden wind, a sound too familiar. For a moment, you're back there, knees in mud, heart in your throat, fingers curled around a weapon you don't remember picking up. You blink, and it's gone, but your hands won't stop shaking. And no one else hears what you did, because they never had to. Generations pass. The battlefield becomes a pasture. Children chase goats through where men once died. The soil still remembers. It grew red once. It swallowed steel and screams. Now it grows quiet things, grass, wildflowers, forgotten bones. But if you dig deep enough, the truth still clings to the roots, because war never really ends. It just gets buried until something unearths it. So here's the uncomfortable truth. We love war stories. As long as we don't have to feel them, we'll wear the costumes, chant the legends, and cheer the victory. But ask too many questions, it gets quiet. What if we remembered every battle for what it really was? What if we looked past the heroes and saw the humans? Imagine walking through a centuries-old fortress. The stone is cold, heavy. You run your fingers along the walls, and there, under layers of moss and royal paint, are names, scratched in with knives, fingernails, desperation. Not kings, not generals, just men, young, scared, forgotten, leaving behind proof they existed, because they knew history wouldn't bother. Every medal has a smell behind it. Every statue has a body underneath. That brave knight you read about, he might have screamed when the arrows started. He might have cried as he crushed someone's skull. He might have lived the rest of his life unable to sleep unless he was near horses and rain. But history needed a clean story, so they gave him a title, a legend, and a silence he never agreed to. Chivalry, that was PR. On the field, rules were rumors. Once swords clashed, mercy became optional, especially if your side was hungry, angry, or just plain bored of dying. Captives, sometimes sold, sometimes tortured, sometimes just a way to blow off steam. It wasn't personal, it was survival, which is to say, it was always personal. If you wanted to survive a medieval battle, it wasn't just about strength, it was about enduring your own thoughts. You had to turn off the part of your brain that screamed, "This isn't right." You had to shut down the questions, the guilt, the empathy, just long enough to swing, block, and swing again. And afterward, you had to live with whatever you'd buried inside yourself to make that possible. Some didn't, some couldn't, some were never seen again, even if their bodies made it back. But here's what's strange. Even in all that ruin, they still sang songs about home. Songs about women they missed or made up. Songs about ale and gods and absurd little jokes. Songs that echoed through frost and filth like a heartbeat under armor. Because when you lose everything, you hang on to rhythm, to story, to something that reminds you you're still human, even if you don't feel like one anymore. But what if those songs weren't just noise in the dark? What if they held something no historian ever wrote down? The brutal truth is, the past wasn't poetic, it was sharp, crude, raw, and the people who lived through it. They weren't extras in someone else's epic. They were real, complex, terrified, brave in ways we barely understand. We owe it to them to look closer, to question the myths, to sit with the discomfort, and to remember that behind every legend is someone who bled just trying to make it home. If this pulled back the curtain on what really went down, and you're hungry for more untold history like this, hit that like button, subscribe, and tell me in the comments. Our next video, we're pulling back the velvet curtain on the woman who ruled an empire while her body was silently betraying her. A queen whose limbs decayed while her power remained absolute. A body rotting in real time while her subjects still bowed and kissed her hand. And after that, we'll meet the Duchess who defied centuries of pressure because she knew her bloodline was a ticking time bomb. You've heard the myths. Now you'll see the real horror hidden behind royal lace and gold leaf. The portraits get darker from here. Alright, you've dimmed the lights. You're cozy, hopefully not eating, because where we're going, it smells like damp velvet, gout cream, and the faintest whiff of cousin kissing. You wake up in a stone-cold castle. Drafty halls, everything candlelit. Your corset is 2 sizes too tight. And your husband, oh he's your uncle, or your nephew, or both. Welcome to European royalty. Let's start with the OG of inbred elegance. Juana of Castile, aka Juana la Loca. Now, people called her mad. But let's be honest, your family tree looked more like a family wreath. You'd probably lose a few screws too. Juana was the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella Yupp, the same ones who financed Columbus, and they thought the best way to keep power in the family was to keep the family in the family, over generations, repeatedly. Juana's genetics. Think of them like a photocopy of a photocopy of a photocopy. By the time she came around, there wasn't much ink left. She married Philip the Handsome. Spoiler alert, was a stretch, but let's give her credit. She loved him obsessively. Like, carry his corpse around for months obsessively. Yep, that happened. But was that true madness or the slow burn side effect of centuries of DNA playing the world's worst game of Uno? And then there's Maria Anna of Austria. Sweet girl, a Habsburg through and through, which meant she came with a jawline so prominent it could cut glass, and a gene pool so shallow it made a puddle look deep. At just 14, Maria Anna was married off to her uncle. Not uncle-like, fun guy who brings you snacks at family parties. No, her literal uncle, the kind you share a grandparent with. She gave birth to a son, Charles II of Spain, also known as the Bewitched. Charles had a jaw you could park a carriage in. He couldn't speak clearly, couldn't chew, and his autopsy revealed he had a heart